Thank you, and if you can please take your seats, we're running a little bit behind. So my name's Jay Healey, and I'm here to kick off the next panel. Brand new senior research scholar here at SIPA in my second week. With me, we've got a distinguished panel to be talking about cyber, critical infrastructure protection, and especially the finance sector. So again, we've got the bios. We're running a little late. We're going to carry this panel until 11:10. I won't do the introductions other than Steve and Paul on my right, Lou and Beth on my left. And we're going to try and structure this in the way of, first we'll be talking about the threat the finance sector is looking at. That will hopefully lead us into sharing and then into the response. And through that, we'll try and look at how the finance sector is working with U.S. government and with other international governments, and how that back and forth is going, because that seems to be a key international and public policy question. Now, finance has always been on the cutting edge in the cyber area. We're hearing a lot about frauds and theft, but one of the biggest early cases was 1994. Vladimir Levin took Citibank, as it was known then, for $10-point-something million back in 1994. Massive fraud. They were able to catch him, get most, if not all, of the money back, and it led to the first Chief Information Security Officer position anywhere at Citi. Steve Katz, who's probably known to many of the panelists here. In 1999, President Clinton had just asked for information sharing and analysis centers the year before, and finance in 1999 came up with the Financial Services ISAC to do this operational level sharing, and it's been one of the strongest information sharing organizations since 2003 time frame. The finance sector said we need something more than just this operational level sharing. We need more governance as a whole, which led to the FIBIC and FISIC, which were doing government sector governance from Treasury, SEC, OCC, CFTC, and the FISIC, which was doing the same thing, governance within the sector itself at the policy level, not at the operational level, which then DHS took and copied that and spread it around the other sectors. It was a great process innovation. And of course, since about that same time, 2003 onwards, you saw innovations like intelligence-driven operations. Maybe didn't come from the finance sector, but was certainly pushed and adopted by the finance sector. Looking at the cyber kill chain was really integrated into the finance sector a few years ago in presumption of breach, which we might hear a little bit later today with Greg Rattray. So again, maybe those innovations didn't start in the finance sector, but they really caught on, they were really pushed and really carried forward. So we're really curious. We heard a great panel just now and talking about the threats, Russia, China, states, non-states, fraud. And so I really want to kick this off with you, Beth, because this is really what you've been in the thick of, not just at Citi, but in your prior career. So can you walk us through the threats and how you're seeing that?
Sure. Thanks, Jay, and good morning. So I'll start by framing my response and saying that I'm not a technologist, and I haven't worked in policy or regulations or governance in any way. I'm an intelligence analyst. So my role in this business of cybersecurity is to be looking to use analytical methodologies to be able to be proactive in addressing the threat landscape. So kind of adding another layer to our defensive mechanisms. And to do that, we really have to understand the intent, the capability, and what it is that the adversary is truly targeting to be able to harm us. So to sort of scope what the threat landscape looks like at a very strategic level, so taking it up a notch from our previous speakers, there's 5 categories that we use. And the first category is on the nation-state advanced persistent threat. So, these, as we all know, these actors are very highly motivated to advance nation-state objectives, and their capabilities are almost unlimitless because they have the infrastructure that the government provides, they have unlimited funding, and what have you. So I wanted to tie this back to a comment that was made yesterday, I believe, by Fadi regarding cybersecurity being synonymous with integrity. And last year, Newscaster was a group that was uncovered that had been in operation since 2011, was a completely false news agency online, had built up their reputation by repurposing legitimate news articles and taking that content and making it their own, posting it, and then more problematically going out and creating false personas on Twitter to get social profiles, to make connections. And it was discovered that over a 3-year period that over 2,000 connections had been made with senior leaders in the US military. Now, the group behind newscasters thought to be affiliated with the Iranian government, and we don't know today for what purpose. So that's kind of an example, again, to tie it back to the nation-state actors. In the next group, we have the cyber criminals, which we've also heard a lot about. So the dean talked about CryptoLocker. You know, cyber criminals are motivated to make money. They extensively use the underground to be able to share exploits, to sell zero-day vulnerabilities and what have you. So criminal group was behind authoring CryptoLocker. And I think when we think about the evolution of where we're going in the cyber threat landscape, it's not just about criminal groups being able to talk with nation-state actors in the same country. It could potentially be that nation-state actors in one country are talking with cyber criminal groups in another country. An example of that is with the Sony attack, the Destover malware that was used, completely separate from CryptoLocker, but started out with that ability to encrypt the file so that Sony couldn't access their data. I'm sorry.
And I really want to zoom in on finance. I mean,
yes.
You're right. These are absolutely the adversary groups, but I'd really like you to zoom in on finance sector specifically if we can.
Absolutely. So in terms of with a threat to finance, specifically with ransom-type ware and ability to destroy data, we have to be concerned with the movement of all of the data packets that are attached to wire transfers that occur globally. So these types of tactics would be very problematic for the financial sector. And then the other two groups are the cyber terrorists as well as the the hacktivists that are out there. Hacktivists, a lot of activity here in New York with Occupy Wall Street that occurred a couple of years ago, targeting the financial sector, trying to take down their websites. On the terrorist side, again, DDoSes that occurred back in 2013, targeting the financial sector because they were not happy with the business engagement that a lot of the financial institutions were going after back in that time. I'll just leave you with the thought that the fifth category here that we are concerned about is the insider threat, and that would apply equally across the board to all industries. And we deal with it separately just because our defensive measures have to be crafted separately than when we're looking at the external threat. But what all of these groups have in common is their ability to communicate, which brings us right back to the discussion here today, is public-private sharing. They don't have to abide by country laws or policies or regulations. And so it's up to us to figure out how we're going to model our communication methods to mirror the way that they are able to expedite their communications.
And in particular, the last panel talked a lot about attribution, but at really the corporate level or the sector level, does it matter? Does it change the way you're going to protect or respond to know, all right, that this group that's looking at us is the Russians or the Chinese or hacktivists? Does knowing actually change your response at all?
It does, because when you know what they're actually capable of doing or what they are specifically interested in, you can evaluate whether or not that's of high value to you as an asset. If it's something like with payment cards, we know that there's a lot of fraud, a lot of loss, but honestly, that's not as important to us as some of the intellectual property that goes behind merger and acquisition deals as a bank we deal with every day.
I love that point, because you talked about how do you balance when you're looking at threats between fraud, disruption, and espionage? I mean, those seems like they're very different kinds of operations and things to protect against. How do you look at those as threats, and how are you rating those? So
we're rating them using risk formula, right? So the threat by the vulnerability by the asset, but then we're also applying an analytical method to be able to ban these threats by really taking a look at what the short-term impact is, and then a long-term impact, and comparing the two together, and then working with our other financial institutions. We are sharing the data between ourselves to fill in those gaps in our knowledge about the threat actors that are carrying out these particular actions. So that's one way that we're going after prioritizing the threat landscape.
That's fantastic, and I'd like to pull that thread there. Thanks for leading us into the information sharing. It's been It's always been a big topic. Finance has been, again, pretty far in the lead on this. Recently, the White House said they're going to have this information sharing and analysis organizations that they want to look at. I'm going to turn to Steve next, because I know, Steve, you've been quite interested in these topics of this interaction between the sector and the government and kind of what the role is of each information sharing bill before Congress. Can you?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying that I have a slightly different way I model adversaries along two axes. One is how skilled they are. The other is how much they're targeting you specifically as opposed to anyone in a particular profile. The virus writers typically aren't targeting people, but they may be very skilled. Insiders may not be very skilled, but they're targeting you specifically. And nation states can very skilled to extraordinarily skilled, and they may or may not be targeting you. But when you talk about where it's coming from, where the attack is coming from, that lets you place the attack along these two axes. If you hear it's coming from Russia and targeting one particular company, that's grounds to be really, really worried. The Iranians are probably less skilled, and so on.
And it gets to Kevin's point about the bear, right? I mean,
yeah.
and it's interesting the way you lay that. It also struck me in what you talked about is the 5 groups you talked about. Those are the 5 groups we were talking about in the 90s, right? I mean, that way of breaking it out. So when you hear, oh my gosh, everything in cyber is changing, take that with a grain of salt. Because again, the 5 adversaries that Beth walked us through have been around for 20 years. But the aggression, the vehemence, the balance between which ones might be hitting you has certainly changed.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, we got off information.
Right.
Anyway.
Right now we're in a bit of a bind about information sharing. In the wake of the Snowden revelations, there's a lot more distrust of government motives. Rightly or wrongly, a lot of groups have gotten concerned, say this is just another vehicle for surveillance, and that the information sharing is not as valuable. Personally, what I would like to see more of is an analog to the NTSB. Someone's going to investigate major incidents, not only malicious ones, but simple, the stock market was off the air for 3 hours because a squirrel hit a cable, and that's happened. Airplanes rarely crash anymore because they used to crash. And the results were thoroughly investigated, publicized. Builders, operators, pilots, and so on have learned. We don't know. We don't learn as a profession from what the failures were, how to build better defenses. So I have a friend who looked at, who read about I think it was the Home Depot attack on point-of-sale systems, and he's in the finance sector. He's a security guy in major Wall Street firms, and why wasn't their network better segmented? Well, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. We don't really know. We don't know what defenses succeed, what defenses fail. And that is the kind of information sharing that I think would be extraordinarily valuable.
Does that get passed around between the companies? I mean, that was originally the goal of the FSISAC, was that we could pass not just what happened, but sort of.
Absolutely. So at least specific to the financial sector, this area is treated as a non-competitive area. It does not create any advantage for us to see our competitive partners be taken down because the actor is only going to pivot and then they're going to attack the next target. And if we have that same vulnerability that they've exploited from our competitor, and our competitor doesn't tell us about it, then we're going to go down. So it only incentivizes us to be able to share those vulnerabilities when we discover them with our competitors.
And that's one of the good things about the finance sector that I think's really led to this. It didn't just have a lot of money sloshing around, but concerned leadership that really that committed to resilience, and it's made up of counterparties rather than competitors. And I think that dynamic of being counterparties and knowing you rely on the other people have to be up to take your trades has really helped stability in the dynamics. And Paul, I'd like to follow up on that, because Steve's point was we don't necessarily know when you're running infrastructure. I mean, it's your job to make sure this is staying up. It's going to have integrity, to use the word that Fada used yesterday. How does this play out for you?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Jay, and thank you for this great audience and set of speakers that we've had here. Tough act to follow this morning. We heard some great insight into the industry issues. As Lou Modano, I run, I should say as a CISO, Lou Modano, I run the infrastructure and the InfoSec team for NASDAQ. And as a leading global exchange, the protection of our critical systems is certainly something that we focus on a daily basis at all levels of our management. As I run the organization, I have two underlying themes, which I think are important to share here and which tie into the many points that we've heard. The first is the theme of constant vigilance. The second is a theme of a culture of security. Now, if I focus on constant vigilance, that theme points to not just the typical engagement at a monitoring standpoint, alerting and logging, but it also ties back to ensuring that the collaboration and the communication amongst not just the government entities, the peer groups, FSI, SAC, et cetera, and the third-party vendors that we use are all in sync as far as sharing of information, extremely important. So we have this view of constant vigilance and what it means to us and why it's important as we run our daily markets, and then a culture of security. We've all heard Kevin talk about the fact that the majority of the incidents, more recent incidents, have occurred because of spear phishing, somewhat simple methods is what I would view as attacks. Certainly the spectrum of sophistication of the nation-state attackers has grown and is continually growing. But when we look at some of the spear phishing attacks and attempts on an organization, it's important that everyone, in whatever role you have in an organization, understands the importance of security and what impact it can have at any moment if you click on something that you shouldn't have or not. So education is extremely important. Ensuring that security is embedded in the mindset of any developer, of any product manager that's bringing a new product to market, it has to be embedded there. Those two as tenets of a strong security program are what, in my mind, go hand in hand. So the collaboration with the government is something NASDAQ supports extremely. It's extremely dear to us that interaction and that going forward in that space, we make as much progress as we can.
And I'd like to follow up on Steve's point. He was saying it would be interesting as we do the sharing to get into the root cause and where the defenses failed. In the session that we had this morning, Kevin had said the technology is largely good. It's the people. They're attacking the people on that. Do you agree with that? I mean, if we know the vector that they're coming in through phishing, do we really have to depend on getting the people not to click on that, or are there some technology solutions? Since I think we do have a good idea, at least for this kind of attack.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
if the technology is allowing people to do the wrong thing, then the technology is faulty. It's not just, I know how to build a really good antivirus system, a really good firewall, what have you. It's got to be usable by people. And if you saw that
I agree.
a heating system was constantly going down because a valve was constantly failing, you wouldn't blame the heating system, you'd blame the valve. And if you've got a system where people are clicking the wrong things, well, don't make it that easy. Make it much harder for them to do, or put in some extra defense there. It's not just the point defenses. You have to look at it as a system. The people are part of the system, and we're not going to be replacing our personnel by Homo sapiens 2.0 anytime soon. We're going to have, education can only go so far. You've got to make it much more difficult for people to do the wrong thing.
I think that's a great thing, and that scales so much better. Like fixing the underlying problems is a lot better than treating people not to do the bad. Are you starting to see those technological, as you talk to your peers in academia and in the company?
The notion of the human element in security and privacy is a comparatively new subfield in computer security. The oldest conference focusing on that is less than 10 years old. It's engineers aren't always good at dealing with people skills.
Yeah.
So I would add, I think that you really need to take a holistic view. People, system, technology, all together. I think if you look at the innovation that's gone on in the technology, and I think this was part of Kevin's point, is that there's been so much innovation in this space that from a practical standpoint, we have to take that good innovation and put it to use, right? So that in my mind, is something that's extremely important to continuing the good fight here. As the hacking community gets smarter, we need to move with that and continually to grow and get smarter. Now, the time to exploit is another point I think that was made earlier. The time to exploit, when a vulnerability is released by, say, Microsoft or any other third party, that time to exploit has shrunk dramatically, meaning the hackers are on it immediately. Now, as an organization that is proactively managing its security environment, we have to get better at, and I think Michael made this point also, everyone will be hacked or has been hacked, right? That should be a common understanding. Now, part of being hacked is how you're dealing with the hack. How quickly you're addressing lateral movement in your environment or preventing it, right? So there are a number of components that, not just the tools, but the processes, the people emphasis, that have to be fine-tuned to enable us to fight a good fight.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things that concerns me across cyber generally is that we're still relatively new in this, and I'm in this era of cyber conflict and crime. I mean, sure, we're 20, 30 years into it, but considering how far we're into, for example, bank robbery, that's a very, very tiny area. And so I'm always kind of concerned what we're doing to think about how things might be different. And I know, so I'd like to bring Paul into the conversation, because you've got this privileged role of both being in academia but working in consulting with a lot of these companies. And so I'm curious how you walk them through about how to better respond with what's happened or what might happen in future.
Well, to pull a couple of threads together,
Please.
everybody's in favor of information sharing, but we point out that there's distrust that's grown because of the Snowden leaks. So how do you share information in a low-trust environment? It's a real challenge. I mean, if I came in here and put up a PowerPoint presentation on recent hacks, that's one way to go about it. One analytical methodology I find is quite powerful for information sharing is wargaming or business gaming. In other words, role-playing simulations where you have the red team that's trying to hack, and then you have corporate executives who are probably don't know as much about IT hardware as they should, but what do they do when they're in a crisis situation? Well, what I see a lot of times is, the word that comes to my mind is panic. Senior executives really don't know what to do, so they default both to the CIO or to the legal team. Particularly if it's a real sensitive issue, like in this, it wasn't finance per se, but the hack of Sony. I've run 2 war games on the Sony hack, and it was very striking how they turned to their legal team to get them out of it. The legal team had didn't even understand the business dynamics of the entertainment industry outside of compliance kinds of issues. So another point I would make too is that what drives this is not so much public policy, but events in the real world. Go ahead.
No, I just want to jump in on the legal point, because it's really interesting. When you heard Kevin just up here, there's a really good chance that Kevin and Mandiant FIRE is not going to be called by the company itself. There's a really good chance that the company is going to call their law firm, and then the law firm is going to bring in Mandiant, so that way it can be protected.
Yeah.
So think about that in the information sharing. Is that the basic way that the first call is to make sure that the company is going to be under client attorney privilege? I'm sorry, go ahead with your second.
No, it's just that the companies, when they're under stress, I mean, we have Timothy Geithner was at Yale this year, and he's giving some lectures, and I sat in on him, and this is just my interpretation. But he describes the pressures of the financial crisis from Treasury it's really a problem in crisis management more than it is finance. And what I see in consulting is companies really don't even know what their objectives are in a crisis. Like, is it to look steadfast and look like you're in charge? Is it to preserve market capitalization? Usually that takes a back seat. And I personally am convinced by turning it over to experts without thinking of the broader dynamics, it really hits market capitalization a lot, and or loss of intellectual property, which was a major issue in the Sony case. So it's a very rich field, and I view these silos like legal and IT. And I would add, there's another very interesting silo that we look at these things, and it's called Edward Snowden is itself a silo, we got to remember that he was looking at this intelligence apparatus through a straw of what he saw. Now, we're all amazed that he saw so much, but there may be a lot going on, particularly in the financial area, that he was not privy to. So if you look at all the sanctions that have been increased, it's well known the Pentagon has played business games with the Chinese dumping treasuries and signaling us in the context of a security crisis. So these are whole new dimensions. And I think we have to also think about the retargeting of NSA and the intelligence community if it went after other kinds of acts, not just terrorists moving money, but the first time like a country like Brazil releases information about a multinational that's violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, going after white-collar criminals using this stuff. It can play in, the public's really fed up with big business in a lot of ways, you may have noticed in recent years. And it could really get a lot of points for a government agency or a prosecutor. There's really new terrain here, and I don't know of a better way. Gaming is one way, I'm not saying it's the only way.
And it's been interesting to see the finance sector has been pretty involved in games. You know, I mean,
Yes.
LiveWire, the first national cyber exercise, 2003, Quantum Dawn. There's been quite a few of these that I think have ticked along. What do you think? Has anything interesting come out of that sector-wide? I'd also like to follow up on Sony. There's going to be kind of a pointed question to finance sector on Sony. And I'm also interested in systemic. I'd like to look at this kind of systemic issue with the finance sector.
A lot of insights that come out of games. I actually got drawn into this in the late 90s. Vice President Gore in the White House ordered a game played on a terrorist attack on Wall Street in the late 90s. And this game was actually played in the North Tower of the World Trade Center, sponsored by Cantor Fitzgerald. And 30 of the people that we played the game, I have the game book still, were killed on 9/11. So, which sort of started all this. But among the interesting things I've seen is the way, like I talked to economists, would China ever start dumping treasuries? And they all say, no, because game theory says it would hurt them too, and they won't do it. But in the games, what we picked up was that the Chinese started shortening the the duration of the treasuries they owned, 90 days to 30 days. And just this signal was sent shocks throughout the people playing the financial markets. So there's a lot of insights. And the whole thrust in modern finance is, the hot thing is behavioral finance. So my thought is that games are a good source of behavioral data, and it sort of fits in with the developments of finance theory.
In a lot of the finance games I've played, the two things came out. One is there's a general rule for internet that it's easy to take something down, it's difficult to keep it down over time in the face of determined defenses. And in fact, that is part of Greg Rattray's PhD thesis. And so easy to take down, hard to keep down over time, especially when there's determined defenses. And that's made me feel like the finance sector is much more resilient as a whole, as we saw after 9/11, I think. Another one of the lessons is that the finance sector can be really good at response in the short term, but that you all have other jobs. I mean, you might be able to good and sustain for a week or two, but after that you might need government. And so how does that work? And maybe I'll start with Lou in talking about that, kind of continuing from last panel and what you might need from government. And then I think, Beth, that can lead us into threat.
Great. So first,
and threat sharing with government, Beth.
So I would agree that I think there is certainly value in gaming. And I think if you look at the finance sector, having been part of it for many years, more than I'd like to admit to, there's a lot of collaboration, there's a lot of exercising in whatever the aspect, whether it's from a BCP standpoint or a true disaster that occurs, there's lots of collaboration. When it's come to cybersecurity, that level of collaboration I think has been taken to a completely higher level. So the information sharing across most of the entities, or the majority of the entities, is there regularly. From an exchange standpoint, we have a committee that's part of the World Federation of Exchanges where we regularly, all the CISOs at the global exchanges share information on any aspect of concern of security. So I think gaming and collaboration in the industry, we have set the bar very high in the finance industry. This is, again, my view of this, having been part of it for many years. we've set that bar very high, and we believe it's working. Now, the government has become part of that a number of years back and is becoming better at sharing their information that they have. One of the wishes we have is when the government does have classified information, is it accelerates how it declasses that information and gets it in our hands. Now, that's not to say that as being a responsible commercial entity, that duty of security relies first with us, right? The same as it does with you when you're protecting your own asset. That duty relies with you first. So I'm not saying that we're relying on the government to do our job, but we're relying on the government to augment and help us do our job. Another example, there are many NASDAQ, other exchanges are considered critical infrastructure. However, we rely on numerous third-party vendors, hardware and software, to do our job. It would be ideal if the government could offer some level of cyber controls, a minimum level that these third parties should adhere to, much like we have on the Underwriters Lab rating on equipment. A similar rating that's given to third parties that assures that they are following certain procedures on the cyber side.
And I mean, so it's interesting because I think the NIST framework is meant to kind of be the.
Absolutely.
Are you using the NIST framework? Are you expecting that Treasury or SEC are going to make it mandatory that you use the NIST
Yes.
framework?
So on the NIST framework, some of you may have heard of the term Reg SCI, which is new regulations that the SEC is putting forward, and much of that is based on the NIST 800-53 framework. There is numerous discussion across the industry of how we are applying those controls and the subset of those controls. So absolutely.
Good. And all right, so start getting ready for your questions. I'm just going to do a little bit more up here, and then we want to go to the audience sooner rather than later. So get yourselves warmed up. And okay, so Beth, information sharing. So we heard good things with government going reasonably well. I mean, I know Treasury has this new Intel cell that they've been setting up. How are things working? How's Treasury? How's DHS? How's DOD?
Right.
How's
So
Justice?
just to maybe follow on what Lou was saying, though, as much as we rely on the government to sort of fill in that picture in terms of, where is the threat coming from and understanding better than how to defend on the network side, the government is absolutely in dire need of our data because we have more data than the government possibly has. So we're going to see a lot of this activity before they're going to see it. And yet we don't necessarily have the means to expedite the sharing of that data. Lou's talking about the classification issues of government trying to downgrade to us. We don't have the classification issues, but we do not have the technological means to connect with the government and be able to expedite indicators and what have you back to the government. In terms of so how we get around this is we're working in forums like the National Cyber Forensic and Training Alliance is a nonprofit forum located in Pittsburgh. Government's there, not just US government, AFP is there, Japanese police are there, UK is there. So this is an effort to be able to bring private partnerships and not just financial sector, although financial sector has a very large representation, but other sides of the business like retail and manufacturing, because if they're seeing it in their world, we're going to see it in our world. And so that's one way to get over that hurdle of being able to expedite the sharing of information. And because it's done on site, you don't have a lot of the issues of trying to put things in an email or encrypted or worry about confidential stamping and that kind of thing.
So I was talking with the bank CISO the other day who said he felt confident that if the government had something, they would let him know. That he was pretty sure that if the government had something about an attack on them, do you share that confidence?
I share the confidence that the government will get around to letting you know.
That's really interesting.
And that lag time is absolutely critical, as Kevin said. I mean, I took a note, 205 days from time of attack to discovery of attack. A lot of damage can be done.
And how do you think this conversation would be different if we didn't have the NASDAQ and Citi? If we had something Federal Credit Union up here, how would this conversation, do you think, be different? And that's kind of open to anyone here.
Well, I think the last panel made the point that the smaller institutions don't have the resources to invest in target hardening, nor do they have there's another risk management technique. It's a really interesting idea. risk management approaches. They don't have the capacity for environment shaping the way large corporations do, to both the tone of the debate and international regulations.
Steve?
Just quick, one comment on the point made earlier about it's hard to keep somebody down. I think that's largely true, but there's one glaring exception in certain circumstances, that when an irreversible action happens. Now, this is more of a concern in, say, the power industry, the chemical industry. You can get large-scale physical damage by some hacks. Finance, in principle, a lot can be reversed. I don't know how easy it is to roll some of this back. I do know that it's been hard to claw back money that has been stolen, even though the transfers have only been electronic. But if I were working on the finance sector, the ability to unwind certain transactions that were done by a massive fraud bot, if you will, would be a very important sort of thing to do. There were news reports came out a few years ago that the U.S. military, the NSA, had plans to electronically steal Saddam Hussein's money, but this was vetoed. The White House and the grounds would be destabilizing to the world financial system. I don't know that all actors would see it as a bad thing. And this means if you have a way to reverse and roll this back, yeah, you'd get a couple of days of disruption while everything's sorted out and dealt with the legitimate transactions. But it's a way to, I'm back on the air, now what? Now, how do I repair the damage?
Yeah, and when General Alexander was doing his testimony to get his 4th star for Cyber Command, they asked him, the House Armed Services Committee asked him, do you think any of these critical infrastructure sectors would be a legitimate target for the United States? And they said, military command and control, electrical, finance. And he said, yes, absolutely, all of those could be legitimate military targets, but I can't imagine a situation where we would attack an enemy's finance sector unless in the unlikely situation it was only used for military purposes. So General Alexander was basically taking finance sector targets off the table, which I'll tell you, as someone, I love to see that. When Admiral Rogers was asked a similar question, he did not use that finance sector cutout. Now, I've talked to their folks, and they've said that was probably an oversight. So, Paul, you talked about the importance of wargaming, and so start catching my eye, by the way, for questions, and I'll start coming out. SIPA helped fund a student war game. It's called the Cyber 9/12 Student Challenge. It was held down in D.C., where we bring in policy students from across the country to war game through, and it's cyber, but they're giving policy advice. Nobody's died yet, Mr. President. We can't bomb them back, look to sanctions. I want to call, because I see at least 2, SIPA got the number 2 team, and Ben and Nate, can you just stand, wave? Is Michelle here? So SIPA had the number 2 team. They beat up my team from SICE by 1 spot. And so I just wanted to call you guys out and recognize, and thanks to Dean Jano for helping fund that Cyber 9/12 Student Challenge. Okay, questions from the audience? Okay, yeah, in the back there, Theresa. And while she's asking, you can go ahead and catch my eye, and I'll record you in the book. Go ahead.
Hi, Elvira Speaker from Columbia Central IT. I was just wondering the reference to vendor management, and what are you doing at NASDAQ to manage your vendors? And also the certification program, kind of what do you have in mind when you mention certification of vendors? I mean, there's SSA 16 and other types of attestations, but I was just curious, kind of how do you envision that whole program?
So we have a lengthy process that our procurement team undertakes at NASDAQ, where it, as part of the courting, as I say, as a new vendor, we put the vendor through a number of paces. You mentioned SSA 16, general philosophies on how they approach the relationship and how much information they actually share. Those are all fundamental ingredients. Part of it is tied to level of certification, and also part of it is tied to the candor that's expressed as part of the relationship. The access that is given to NASDAQ to not just the sales front or the account management team, but also to the teams behind the scenes that are actually building products, and also the executive management. So we do our best to form relationships at all those levels. And earlier I mentioned the fact that there's a lot of innovation in this space. We also do our best, and we're known through our history of being innovative in the technology space. And it's important for us as we look to vendors is to capture that level of innovation. So there's not a formula that easily addresses all those parameters. There's a number of subsets of steps that we take before we're comfortable having a vendor be part of our family of services.
But I love this vendor management. Sometimes I've heard it called advanced contract management, because it's pushing out that risk horizon. You know, instead of saying we have cyber risks, they're in our own servers, they're in our own people, it's pushing that risk horizon out so that you can be understanding the risk that others might be taking on your behalf because of that interconnection.
Absolutely. And I think Paul mentioned earlier about how the legal team is typically engaged. I think, again, any progressive view towards dealing with cyber, it varies by company, obviously. I think it's important for an organization to take the preventative steps, not just from protecting itself from an attack, but being prepared for the steps after an attack or a breach. So Kevin was here earlier. Kevin's organization is certainly an organization that we have a relationship with at NASDAQ. That relationship is in place not after an attack, but we have it prescriptively earlier in the cycle. So one of the things I would advise most companies is to think through the steps that occur after an incident and what you would do, and take those steps much earlier in the process so that you're a few steps ahead of the communication. The point was also made that when you're breached, everyone knows about it sometimes before you do. Again, an obvious in today's world. If you can be proactive and get those foundational steps done up front before an incident, you're that much better to cope when an incident does occur.
If I can also add about vendors outside of the technical realm, we work with a lot of vendors, of course, for information. And so we are now looking at a process to put into place to evaluate how they're collecting their information, because they have to go into the underground for some of the information that we're asking for, and it has now come to light that perhaps some of the activities that they are engaging in are not in line with what we deem to be ethical. So that's another thing that we are now taking a hard look at.
So we've been largely talking about this in a U.S. context, but certainly the finance sector is one of the most international and internationally governed. How does it work through with that happening with, are you seeing multi-stakeholder governance, like through your Bank for International Settlements or in Basel, or is it still largely bilateral with individual governments? How are other governments getting involved? Is the U.S. working with their counterparties overseas, like through Treasury or?
To gain information?
To look at this issue. I mean, are you getting questions from any other governments in this area? I mean, are the Brits saying let's share? Are the are the authorities in Milan or Frankfurt saying let's share, or are this still largely a U.S. issue?
No, it is absolutely global. I appreciate you making that point. Of course, each government has a little bit of a different twist on the types of information sharing forums that they're willing to engage in. But we have, for example, information security officers. There's 700 of them all over the world who go out and specifically cultivate their counterparts within the governments to determine how city can exchange information, and then also how can we be better informed if things arise in those countries. So it is, but yeah, to your point, it is not all networked together. It is, for the most part, being done more on a country-to-country basis, and perhaps, best case scenario, being networked within the region.
Mm-hmm. And I did want to come back on the vendor management point. I think it was last year, maybe 18 months ago, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency came out with a letter saying that for the banks that they supervise, they did want to see that looking at suppliers and vendors is needed to start being in that mix of that risk management, which I thought was an important step. I mean, I prefer kind of a light touch regulation, but I thought it was a really important step for the OCC to start adding that in, because I think it's very useful. Steve?
In some areas, I think that one of the obstacles we were seeing are these disclaimers of liability in software and so on. Someone mentioned Underwriters Lab certification. It's important to remember that Underwriters Lab is from the insurance industry. Things like the National Electrical Code is from the fire insurance industry, still is. We're not seeing that regulatory pushback because of these disclaimers of liability that were not really tolerated in many other industries than software. And I think we need to see more risk being pushed back onto the vendors. Not everyone's in a position of a NASDAQ to do this kind of very thorough vetting of vendors. And I imagine even for smaller contracts, even you can't do nearly as much as for the large contracts. So we need to see the responsibility accepted more. And there are a lot of objections to that, obstacles to that. It would take a fairly thorough study to even start to understand what the implications of that would be for the software industry. But we're not seeing some of the market dynamics helping that we do see in other places.
Why do you think that is? I mean, it seems like finance sector would be natural to do that. I mean, for a while we thought that DoD or government procurement would help drive security, and it really didn't turn out that way. Government just wasn't that good at it, and in some ways, government was even split personality, right? They want to see better security in some areas, but not in others, so that way they can still get a touch in. Do you think finance is a good place to?
I think finance is in a better spot than most to do it. As I think some of it's got to do with the nature of a software purchase. You're not purchasing the software; you're purchasing a license. It's a contract. It's not a physical good. A lot of the rules have not applied traditionally.
How do you know software is good? I mean, if you're buying software from a vendor, or if you're doing your own internal software? I guess internally you've got your own software testing process. What do you do if you're bringing in software from someone else that you know is going to be good for your process?
So it's a great question, great comments that Steve had as well. And I think, again, it goes back to there is a level of trust that you have to have with whomever the vendor is that you're dealing with. There's a level of testing that your team needs to do as well.
Yeah. Trust but fortify. Yeah.
Exactly. But there's no easy answer to that question, other than what I just shared with you. Now, one of the things the government can do is to consider offering incentives to these third parties. Call it a tax break, tax credit, whatever shape it would take, to the vendors that are actually proving that they are living up to, whether it be an ISO 27000 family of standard or other. I think that is an approach, if we want to go down the policy route, that we want to try and tweak and try to get some action.
Let me push back a bit, but I mean, why would you be buying from someone that isn't living up to those standards? I mean, if you want the standards, shouldn't your dollars be the one that does that rather than the taxpayer?
To be fair, but there's a lot of open source tools that people use, and where's the oversight in that space? That's pretty much a community-driven, trusted source, a somewhat trusted source. So, again, maybe not the best answer, but an answer.
Yeah, great. Sir? Up front here. And again, if you just catch my hand. Or catch my eye, and I'll call on you next.
Henning Schutzer, Columbia. Going back to Steve's comment, one of the question that I always wondered about is that it seemed to have been a notion that we've believed for far too long that software is somehow different, that we couldn't do the engineering things that we know of. Do you see that changing? Do you see a perception that we can apply engineering principles that we used to in civil engineering, electrical engineering? You mentioned underwriters laboratories, but we have a tradition in aeronautical engineering, a safety culture, if you like. We have a culture in civil engineering, a safety culture designed for redundancy and over-engineering and all of that, as opposed to the kind of model and underinvestment. I mean, you mentioned open source. What I think doesn't often get mentioned is that we don't spend any money. We expect magic to happen and people to work for free on really boring stuff. And we know in almost any other business, that's not likely to work very well. So do you see models of supporting, of getting infrastructure support so that critical open source tools are strengthened, not relying on one volunteer amateur?
Yep. Steve, on you.
I've been hearing for more than 40 years that we need to turn software development into another branch of engineering with all its rigor. And yes, it's actually gotten better. You know, when I started programming almost 50 years ago, it was unusual for a mainframe to survive for a day without crashing. Today, I see computers that have been up for a couple of years without being rebooted. So we've made progress, but we're trying to do far more ambitious things. The rate of increase in the complexity of what we're doing has outstripped the rate of improvement in our ability to build it well. It seems so easy to write some code, and too much code is written by people who don't have this kind of deep professional training. When you read of a 20-year-old who's got the billion-dollar startup, that's great, but I doubt the 20-year-old has the software maturity to have learned how to do this well, and they're playing catch-up. The phrase technical debt is popular in the industry. It's culture of ship first, test later, patch after that, which is great for being a first mover in the market, but lousy for getting good, reliable software. It's really, really expensive to develop stuff that's really high quality. We see it in places like avionics software. We see it in places like some of the process control, phone switch engineering, but it's much more expensive to develop software that way, and a lot of companies just can't afford it or don't understand that.
I would argue it's actually a harder problem in civil engineering because there's so many branching. The complexity has grown so fast. I mean, that's one of the big pushes in computer science, to which problems you can test and which you can't. And automata theory, NP completeness, and all this stuff. Our understanding has gone up a great deal, but I completely agree with Steve that the complexity of the systems has gone up faster.
And it's I ran across a bank that had an example. This was perhaps not quite 10 years ago. There was a product that they were going to be selling direct market access in China. So clients could trade through the bank as if they were the bank and make direct trades in Shanghai and Shenzhen. And code was written by a Chinese company, and the local security team ran it through Fortify, I think was the code testing tool, to say, is this good code? And it had something like 435 critical coding errors. And then like the importance, you know, and then it went downhill from there in the numbers. And so the security team said, well, we're going to need to bring in someone, you know, a specialist from at Stake or somewhere that knows Chinese, that knows code to improve this, minimum $50,000 just to assess it, and then we don't know how much more to fix it. The code cost the bank $35,000. So you had the business side say, wait a minute, we don't even have a customer for this yet. We're getting no income from this. And your bill from information security is going to be probably 3 or 4 times what it cost us to even buy the code to begin with. Let's just buy the code, see if we attract any clients, and then afterwards we can fix it. And it's really tough in that back and forth between those managing directors, right? The managing directors from the information security side. What's the actual best risk management there? Starting off with 0 and buying it secure, but when the cost of security is a multiple of where it comes across. And how does that sound?
I'm chomping at the bit at this one a little bit. So and just to put this in perspective, I go back to my education comment, and it's not just about educating people about spear phishing, but it's also educating an organization about what does a breach mean to an organization from a brand impact standpoint. So certainly there are applications that do not cost the organization a lot to develop, but if there is a breach of such application, the noise, the pain, the lawsuits that come along with it far exceed the cost of whatever security tool you used to test that code. I can give you an example. We do extensive testing of our source code of any application that we bring to the market. There are a number of innovative new vendors, as I talked about. Aside from Fortify, there's vendors known as Veracode, Coverity, that do this for a living. They're relatively new to the industry, and they offer they do exactly what Steve's talking about as far as the testing that's needed to reveal the gaps. So we know that as people develop code, there is always going to be flaws in that code. So it needs to go under the rigor of some level of testing to find where the gaps are, and then have the assurance of the development team to fix those gaps. But for someone to say it's not the level of information security cost or investment does not match the return on the product, they're not seeing the full picture.
Right. And I love those words, the rigor and discipline that came across these answers. We had a question here. The woman here, can you put up your hand so that the mic can come to you? Thank you. And then I think this will be the last question from the floor, and then I've got one or two.
My name is Lucia Cannon, and I just wanted to ask, if you are a small financial institution and you don't have resources of the Citibank, where do you go to find information about how are other financial institutions being attacked? What can you do about it? Because I think that would be so helpful, essentially, because we are also being attacked, and we don't know that this is going on all over the place. And, there hasn't been any catastrophic results, but who knows, maybe in the future it might get worse.
Great question. So, taking that position of, we're only as strong as our weakest link, we have to, bind together to be the strongest that we can be in sharing the information. So some of the resources you can find through government publications just offered on the internet. So depending upon where your bank is headquartered and what have you, or what country, it might vary. But again, a lot of these attack vectors that are used in attack tactics, you could gain from, just by going on and doing U.S. government searches, Treasury and DHS and what have you. Also, of course, as Jay had mentioned, the information sharing forums, the Financial Services ISAC is another great forum, very well-respected, renowned, an area where you can get this information. And ISACs, there are some ISACs internationally that are now just getting their legs underneath them, that are coming together and also producing not just publications, but actually offering technical indicators at the time of a compromise.
And I'd throw in two others. The FSI SAC, it used to only be for paying members. You would only get information if you were writing your check for $10,000 or $50,000. We got a Treasury grant back in 2003, and that said, I had been the vice chairman around this time, that said everybody has to be able to join and get information. So any U.S. accredited financial institution can get information from the FSI SAC. That's going to be best practices. That's going to be general threat information. Also, your industry associations. The American Bankers Association, American Community Bankers Association, I forget what the credit union association is. But those are all represented in the FISIC, in this governance structure for the finance sector as a whole. So no matter what kind of financial institution you are, you've got representation in New York that you're paying dues to, and has representatives here and they'll have some information as well.
Yeah, the SEC and the Fed their officials have given speeches just recently this year on the weak links in the financial system, which they identified as the hedge funds and the law firms, which is quite interesting because you don't think of it, but the sensitive information that law firms have for a lot of the big bank or smaller ones is really considerable.
Yeah. And I like that you brought up the regulators, because I'm sure the regulators, you're not going to want to ask the regulators, obviously, but I'll bet if you go to the regulators' webpage, they're going to have some information and guidance there as well. I don't want to say guidance, that sounds regulatory. Suggestions and things that you might do. Okay, any final thoughts from the panel? And why don't we go this way?
Is that what I need to?
Okay, because I've got one zinger that I want to ask.
No, this is going to be an ongoing measure, countermeasure, and there's many roads up the mountain. many methodologies. We should use as many of them because they give us different perspectives. But this, taking this as a 30-year problem, looking at it that way, gives you different perspectives than how can I stop the attack tomorrow morning? And that's very useful.
Yeah, I was going to let this go by, but I just bubbling over to ask. I'm really curious. So again, as we've seen changes in what the cyber adversaries do, we heard yesterday how much Sony was a game changer. Now, I don't want to know if NASDAQ or Citi would do against a Sony, because I don't want to make it particularly to your companies. But in general, I've seen finance sector is, we're used to espionage. The bad guys are going to be in, they're going to rattle around our system. We find them hopefully quickly, but days, weeks, months, and then we boot them. That may not work in a Sony, where they're in, it's a smash and grab, they want to embarrass, they might not need as much time in the system. Can you imagine that happening to the finance sector? Or are there other issues like that you're thinking about that you want to start gearing the sector up to responding to next?
So I would say it can happen in any sector. I think some sectors are better prepared than others. I think the financial sector is one that is a bit more prepared, but is also vulnerable to such an attack. We've taken what we believe are the right steps to segment our networks and the businesses, but we never want to leave the false impression that we're not vulnerable. We're vulnerable just as much as anyone else is, and it's prudent to be vulnerable. I think as one of our peers asked about being a smaller company, whether you're a small company, large company, have lots of resources or limited resources, the cyber vector or the cyber vectors, the cyber attackers take many different shapes, and they change shape regularly. So it's a bit of a moving target, and I think for anyone to say that their environment is impervious to such an attack is effectively doesn't know what they're talking about or are lying to you. So that's the way I look at it.
That's a solid, honest answer. That's really good, Lou. Thank you very much. Beth?
Destructive malware is everybody's worst nightmare, but perhaps in the position that I sit in, mobile is going to be the next major issue for financial institutions in terms of our ability to enable people to do the transactions that they need to do and not be behind a desktop to do them. So mobile is going to be the next area to really potentially, we'll see some innovative attacks against. And if I may, then my final comment would be that if you are seeking information in this space and somebody tells you that you can't have it, continue to seek the information, because it's not guarded, it is not, like I said, competitive, and there really is no reason not to be able to share the information. So just I would leave you with that.
That's really good. Any other last comments from the board?
We fixed all the problems we know about.
Yep, Steve?
The finance sector does appear to be doing better than most. Banks and the military, the two sectors that have the longest tradition of really sophisticated attackers going after them, so they've learned to take the threat seriously. They are doing the best. The reported problems at J.P. Morgan Chase are actually the most surprising report of a major hack I've seen in recent years, because the banks do such a good job compared to other sectors. But no one is immune. And one of the bigger risks that I see to the finance sector is, I don't think it's mobile as much, because there it's a very narrow interface, mostly a consumer-like interface of moving around fairly small amounts of money. But the big inter-organization links, we can do all kinds of strange things, all kinds of strange financial instruments that most individuals have never heard of. Those are the ones that worry me, because it's a less stressed channel. If the attacker gets into one of your peers, then it's effectively an insider attack from a unsuspecting spot where your own processes and internal controls don't work as well. So that's the thing that scares me.
Yep.
Shadow banking.
Shadow bank, yeah.
And we will draw under the line there, so please give me please thank the panelists with me.